Welcome to Story Reading. Before listening to this story, I can say that the story is very difficult. Please listen carefully. The stove. Nothing could satisfy the great iron stove.
I'll be back with the doctor in 3 days at the latest. I've left you enough wood for 3 days, and you have plenty of food. Garth looked at his sister anxiously. Suddenly he leaned forward and brushed her cheek lightly with his thick, yellow beard. "I hate to leave you," he said gently, "but I guess it's Derek's only chance. Of course you must go." "It's Derek's only chance." Dorette faced her brother. Pale and thin, she looked weak, but she was born in the wilderness and possessed a spirit of steel. She said quietly, "There'll be nothing for me to do, nothing, but wait. Only look after yourself and keep the stove going. I'll do it. And you if you meet Martin Dufour dash." Rage suddenly blazed in her brother's eyes. The barrel of his rifle gleamed as he gripped it. "If I meet Martin Dufour," he said through his teeth, "it will be the end of him or me." He turned without saying another word and headed down the forest trail on his way to Mandor. Dorette watched him until he was just a dark shadow among the trees. All sound, all movement seemed to go with him. She knew that all around her, mile after mile, there was nothing but silence, the silence of the lonely and desolate forest of the north. She went into the cabin and locked the door behind her, as if the loneliness were an enemy she had to keep out. The cabin was a pleasant place. The walls were made of red cedar, and there were 4 rugs on the floor and red curtains on the windows. The cabin was divided into 2 rooms. In the center of the larger room stood the great iron stove. In the winter, that stove kept them alive. The roar of the stove filled the cabin like a hungry voice. Dorette swung open the heavy door and felt the heat on her face as she flung in some wood to feed the fire. That was her job now until Garth came back feeding the stove. She went to one of the bunks and looked down. Derek, her younger brother, lay in the bed without moving. He had been that way ever since Garth and the men had carried him in and put him there. He had been shot and drowsed between life and death. From time to time he sipped a little soup, unaware that someone was feeding him. Dorette did not dare to touch him. There was nothing she could do for him but make sure that the cabin was warm enough to keep him alive until the doctor came, for the cold of that country kills like a sword. At the side of the bunk she whispered, "If only you could speak to me, Derek. If only I could hear your voice." But the only voice was the voice of the great iron stove. She thought about the scene Garth had described to her. How Garth and the men had tracked the outlaw, Martin Dufour, to a lonely little shack in the snow. How Garth had shouted for Martin to come out of the shack. How a shot had come from nowhere, striking Derek. How the men had rushed into the shack and found it empty. Martin Dufour had escaped again. She saw it all. In her mind she saw the scene she had not witnessed. And she heard Garth's hard voice again. "But he's not going to get away this time. He'll have to get food and shelter somewhere. And if it's 1,000 miles away, we'll follow and shoot him down like the wolf he is." She glanced around, shaken, thinking that she still heard Garth's voice filled with bitter rage. But it was only the roaring stove humming its angry song. She busied herself, doing whatever work she could find. Twice she fed the stove from the pile of wood on the floor beside it. The fierce heat licked out at her each time, like a savage beast striking through the bars of its cage each time she shut the door. She felt as though she were locking up some living thing. She glanced at the clock. Only an hour of the slow time had passed. Garth had been gone only an hour. She turned the clock toward the wall, took out a shirt she was making for Garth, and started to stitch it. As she worked, she heard the soft thud of snow falling from trees in the forest. She could hear Derek's weak, shallow breathing. Now and then his heart seemed to pause. Then she held her breath until her brother's heart resumed its weak rhythm. So the morning passed. In the afternoon, she found a snowshoe that needed restringing. She twisted the gut and wove the net, working carefully on it. It was dark sooner than she could have hoped. The stove filled the cabin with its glow. Glancing at the windows, she saw that they were covered with frost. It would be a cold night. She thought about Garth and then with dread about Martin Dufour. She dragged her coat from the other room, set it in front of the stove, and lay down. The warmth was like a hand pressing on her eyelids. 5 times during the long night, she woke up to feed the stove. The last time she awoke, the sun had risen. The frost on the window was glowing. Durette went into the other room and combed her hair. That day passed as the first had done, although it seemed to her that her brother looked weaker. She pleaded with him, "Take a mouthful of soup. Take it for my sake, Derek." But her voice could not reach him. The diminished heap of logs on the floor showed that there was work for her to do. She must bring in a fresh supply from the pile of firewood behind the cabin. She ate a quick breakfast. Then, putting on her coat and hood to protect herself from the cold, she opened the door. She stepped into a world of white, blue, and black, a world sparkling brilliantly as though made of gems. It was fiercely cold. She shut the door behind her, ran quickly to the snow-buried woodpile behind the cabin, and gathered an armful of small logs. Then she returned to the cabin, pushed open the door, and tumbled the wood onto the floor. She worked that way all morning. As she did, her spirits rose, and she began to feel better. She began to believe that Derek would not die, and remembered that Garth would return soon. She was pleased with the crashing noise the logs made as she threw them on the floor. It was a change from the one unceasing voice that filled the cabin day and night, the voice of the stove. The second night she was restless. At first she dared not sleep, for fear that she would sleep too soundly. She could hear the wind whistling loudly. The great stove sang to a higher note. She could hardly keep up with its consuming hunger. The pine and birch logs burned to ashes in minutes. When she did sleep, she dreamed that the cold was creeping into the cabin in long fingers of frost that twisted, like snakes, under the door. One touched her on the throat, and she woke up, choking. Dawn found the sky filled with clouds, the cabin warm, the sick man still alive. As the day went on, her heart grew lighter. In 4 or 5 hours, Garth should be back with the doctor from Mandor. She wound the clock and turned it so that it faced the room. She no longer dreaded seeing the passage of time. 5 hours went by and Garth had not yet arrived. She went to the door, closing it behind her to prevent the cold from entering the cabin for even a moment. She stared down the trail. It ran straight for less than half a mile, beyond that she could not see. Garth, Garth, Garth. Who had uttered that wild cry that echoed among the trees? She paused for a moment. Then she realized that it had come from her. She decided she must see beyond the bend in the trail. She built up the fire, put on her coat and hood and snowshoes, took a glance at Derek, and left the cabin. She sped down the trail. She was panting when she reached the curve. Almost afraid to look, she saw the long track of footprints in the snow leading away. She saw nothing else. She did not dare to go on. She turned around and ran home. The clock ticked off another hour, 2, 3, 4. Garth had not returned. Darkness, and he had not come. Loneliness and suspense were shaking her strong, young nerves. Worst of all was the silence. The voice of the stove was at first annoying, then it became intolerable. She threw the wood in angrily. If there was only someone to speak to, she said a little wildly, just someone to give me a word. There was no one then nor through the endless night. She stayed awake all night, afraid to fall asleep, fearful that the stove that kept them alive might go out. Dawn came and Garth still was not there. There was no wood left in the cabin. Before she did anything else, she put on her coat and went back to the woodpile. The wood was piled high against the back of the cabin and was covered with snow. She pulled at a log and the wood came tumbling down. The hard work was a relief to her as she piled a load so heavy she swayed under its weight. "It's something I can do for Derek," she said. "It's all I can do." "Garth will be back by then," she muttered, staring at the stove. Just then the stove sent a screaming rush of flame up the pipe, as though it were mocking her. She felt a hatred for it as she went wearily out again to gather enough wood for the night too. She kneeled beside the woodpile and reached in for the logs. She felt nothing but snow. She pushed her arm into the snow up to her shoulder. Still she felt nothing but snow. Her heart began to pound loudly. She found a long stick and prodded the pile, but still she found nothing but snow. How did it happen? She asked herself over and over. Easily enough. She or Garth or Derek had been taking logs from the other side of the pile. A large drift of snow had slipped down from the roof and had filled the empty spaces in the pile. What they believed were logs was no more than a huge heap of snow. Durrett turned slowly and went into the cabin. She stood near Derek's bunk and stared at the wood on the floor. It was enough for the day, but what about the night? Would Garth return before the night? She looked around the cabin. There were things there, things that would burn. Her brown eyes grew wider. There was war in them as she leaned over and kissed Derek's cheek. He did not stir from his sleep. "Sleep well, Derek," she whispered. "I'll take care of you." She took Garth's heavy axe and began on the chairs. They were heavy and clumsy things. Garth had made them himself and was proud of them. Still, they would feed the stove well. But they were hard and difficult to chop, and Durette's hands had been scorched by the door of the stove. As she toiled, striking each blow sharply and cleanly, her eyes searched the cabin for firewood. That box could be used, that shelf, the table. The wind howled loudly outside, and the day was full of sounds. Now and then she ran to the door, crying, "Garth." But each time she saw nothing but the forest and the snow. By early evening, she had chopped up everything in the cabin. Each stroke sent pain to her shoulder from her burned and bruised hands, but she did not feel it. And still the stove roared, ever hungry. The drywood from the cabin burned quickly, like straw. The great iron stove must be fed, and she had nothing to feed it. She took the axe and went out. The gray forest stood before her in snow and in shadows. There must be 100 fallen boughs within range of the cabin. She found one and dragged it from the snow into the cabin. She tore off the branches and thrust them into the stove. Blood from her hands stained the wood that she threw into the fire. She went out again. There was a large branch hanging down from a spruce. She tore at it desperately with all her strength, but it would not move. It was frozen. She swung the axe against it again and again with all of her might until, finally, the axe handle turned in her weary hand and fell. She stood there exhausted and breathing heavily. The bitter snow stung her face like the heat of the stove. What should she do? She knew it was important to keep her head and think. If she stayed there, the stove would go out. She turned and looked around. In the growing darkness, she saw a man who stood with a rifle on his arm. He was looking at her. Garth. Oh, Garth. But even as the words left her lips, she knew it was not Garth. She saw a man dressed in heavy furs, his face hidden in the hood he had drawn forward above his fur hat. He stood there silently, strangely still. Then, suddenly, she remembered something. "The stove," she said. "The stove." "What stove?" "The stove. The stove in our cabin. There's no more wood for the stove." The man seemed not to understand. "The stove," she repeated. "They're in the cabin. It's going out." Still he waited. "There's a sick man there, my brother," she said finally. "Are you going to help me?" She imagined, somehow, that he was laughing in the shadow of his hood. "But why should I help you?" he asked. She had no more words. Silently she held out to him her bleeding hands. After a long minute he stirred slowly. Without a word he placed his gun on 2 branches that grew above her reach. He lifted the axe from the snow, made a dozen sharp cuts, and watched the branch fall. Then, putting his foot on it, he chopped it quickly into 4 or 5 pieces. As each piece rolled free, Dorette grabbed it the way a starving woman might grab bread. "That enough?" She stared at him. "No, no," she stammered. "It's not enough for the night. Cut me some more." She turned away and hurried toward the cabin. Halfway there he overtook her. Without a word he lifted the logs from her arms into his own. She was too tired to thank him. Without speaking, she moved at his side, conscious only that help was here. She might yet save Derek. In the cabin there was no light at all, no glow from the stove. Dorette swung open the door of the stove. She saw only a handful of gray-red ashes. With trembling hands she grabbed a few twigs and threw them into the stove. The man who had followed her pushed her aside. She watched as he broke a few branches and coaxed them into flame. He tickled the appetite of the stove with some larger branches. Soon the fire took hold of the logs and fed upon them, hissing. He shut the door of the stove and turned to her. She had lit a lamp and in the light stood looking at him. Her eyes were filled with gratitude. "My brother's still living," she said, pointing to Derek in the bunk. The man's eyes did not follow the gesture as he said abruptly, "You stay here with him. I'm going to get more wood." "You're a good man," she said. "I want to thank Dash." But before she could finish speaking, he was at the door and out into the night. He returned in half an hour, loaded down with wood. He did not speak to her, but busied himself feeding the stove. Then he picked up the axe and went out again. When he returned the second time, she was asleep. Silent and untiring, he worked all night. When she awoke the next morning, the man who had fed the stove all night was standing in the doorway. The door was open, and there was a frosty freshness in the air. The world outside was bright with sun. A crow called in the forest. She looked at the stranger and said, "I did not mean to sleep." Why did you let me sleep while you worked? He said, almost roughly, you were all tired out. She said, I knew you were a good man. Well, he answered slowly, for one night. His furred hood hid his face. She said, let me see you. Let me see your face. Why? She faltered, confused. She did not know why, because of what you have done of what we owe you. We? My brothers and one. Derek's still alive. I almost think he's sleeping better, more natural. When Garth comes home, he'll thank you too. He had turned away from her again and was gazing down the trail. After a moment he said, there's coffee on the back of the stove and some cornbread. You'd better eat. I've had some. She had just reached the stove when he called, asking her to come to the door. When she joined him there, she saw again that strange look on his face that she had seen the night before. He said quickly, You're looking for your brother to come back? Yes, yes. Any time. With another man? With the doctor. Why? He raised his arm and pointed. In the glistening snow, she saw two small, dark figures just rounding the curve in the trail. Her heart was flooded with thankfulness. Yes, yes, it's him and the doctor. Now you'll let him thank you. Her words almost ended in a question, for she saw that he had his rifle on his arm and was putting on his snowshoes. Suddenly she felt uncomfortable. There was something in his silence, in his stillness, that was ominous and threatening. She looked at him. In the shadow of the hood his eyes gleamed at her. She breathed, Who are you? You'll know in a minute. He looked swiftly from her to the two men down the trail. They were coming on fast. When they were so near that their faces could be seen, he quickly pushed her into the cabin. A bullet from the distance struck the snow near his feet. As a second bullet sent up a spray of dusty snow, the man raced into the forest and disappeared. Durrett rushed to the door. She saw Garth down the trail, raising his rifle to fire again at the stranger. Get back, shouted Garth. That was Martin Dufour.